Hi, welcome to this year's Shabbos Hagadol Drosha. It's Tovshin Pei 2025. Thank you so much to George and Susie Fishman who sponsored this drosha in memory of Katarina de Widder, Chaya Pearl Esther, Bas Menachem Mendel, Alea Sholem, whose yahrzeit is on the 27th of Adar. May her neshama have an aliyah, may we all be zeicha to see Tchias HaMeisim. Now, imagine standing in a cellar in Moscow in the 1960s, your hands blackened from soot, baking matzahs for Pesach by candlelight. Or picture yourself as a French Jewish soldier in Napoleon's army in 1810, trying to get food for Pesach far away from home. Or imagine you are stuck on the front lines of war-torn Europe in 1915 during the horrific carnage of the First World War. No food at all, and certainly no Pesach food. What are you to do? Must you retain the stringent rules of Pesach? Strictly no chometz and no kitnius? Or are you allowed to eat whatever is available? Today, I'm going to talk about some of the giants who have dealt with these questions and taken it upon themselves to give rulings that display a human touch while at the same time they adhere to the traditions of Halacha. And the concern for observant Jews in difficult situations facing Pesach didn't begin in the last 200 years. It began a very long time ago in the Roman era when Jews served in the legions of the fast expanding Roman Empire. On a Roman military document dated 96 CE, there is a reference to the wheat for the Jews. Apparently, someone high up in the Roman army scribbled a note on a piece of pottery, no less, asking for wheat to be sent to the Jews. And not just any wheat, it had to be special, clean wheat, raw and unprocessed. Why? Because it was Nisan, the month of Pesach, and there were Jewish soldiers in the Roman army who needed the wheat for flour to bake matzah. Now, to be honest, I don't know what surprises me more, that there were observant Jews in the Roman military, or that the Roman military made room for their religious observance. We're talking about an empire that wasn't exactly known for its sensitivity to minority rights, and the Roman attitude to religious Jews was not positive. Only 26 years earlier, the Romans had ransacked Jerusalem and burnt down the temple. At the same time, here they were, coordinating kosher for Pesach rations for Jewish legionaries. Even more amazing is that these Jewish soldiers were apparently allowed to shecht their own animals. They could also trade away their pork rations for lamb, and they were not expected to drink non-kosher wine. You'd think this story was made up, but it's real. Archaeologists have uncovered the written order on a shard of pottery, what they call an ostrakon, and it's changed the way historians think about Jewish life in the Roman army. It also raises a fascinating halachic and moral question. How do you keep halacha when you're embedded in a system that doesn't care about it at all? Can you cut corners, or are you expected to be strict and uncompromising? And I know we've all heard stories about great tzaddikim who refused to put anything that wasn't kosher in their mouths, but not all of us are great tzaddikim. In fact, most of us are not tzaddikim. So, what are our halachic obligations? What are the expectations? How do we navigate such a difficult situation? Let's fast forward 17 centuries from the Roman Empire to Napoleonic Europe. It's a strange little blip in Jewish history, and it took place in a location called the Kingdom of Westphalia, which was one of Napoleon Bonaparte's grand plans that didn't quite pan out. In 1807, after Napoleon had conquered much of Central Europe, he carved out a new satellite state in Western Germany that he called the Kingdom of Westphalia. The kingdom lasted all of 6 years, from 1807 to 1813, before being reabsorbed into the shifting post-Napoleonic map. And who did Napoleon put in charge of this brand new kingdom? His youngest brother, Jerome Bonaparte. He became King Jerome of Westphalia, the only monarch of Westphalia in all of history. In any event, Jerome was many things. He was charismatic, he was flamboyant, he was charming, and he was also famously extravagant. He loved the finer things in life: palaces, opera houses, ballrooms. The trouble was that he also had a kingdom to run, and Westphalia was bankrupt from day one. And so, to fund his lavish lifestyle and over-the-top projects, Jerome taxed the local population, his subjects, heavily, and introduced a series of odd quasi-taxation policies to save money for the state so that he could use available cash for his pet projects. One of those policies was a military quartering system, which meant that families were obligated to house and feed soldiers in their private homes. And that included Jewish households who were expected to feed all the Jewish soldiers from Napoleon's army, even during Pesach. And that's where things got complicated. In 1810, there was a severe matzah shortage, probably as a result of the ongoing Napoleonic Wars, which meant wheat and flour were in short supply. The Jewish communities of Westphalia were under-resourced and already very strained, and they simply couldn't bake enough matzah to feed all the soldiers. And you couldn't exactly refuse to feed a soldier quartered in your house. That was a punishable offence. So, what did they do? They turned to the newly formed Consistoire Israélite, which was a centralized lay and rabbinic council established under Napoleonic rule to supervise Jewish life. This council included three prominent local rabbis: Rav Leib Meir Berlin, Rav Shimon Kalkar, and Rav Mendel Steinhardt, who was the nephew of the celebrated German Pesach Rav Yosef Steinhardt, author of the important work Zichron Yosef. Rav Mendel himself had also authored a popular sefer, as had the other two rabbis on the Beis Din. To be clear, although Rav Steinhardt is not remembered today, he was a significant rabbi in his time, and most importantly, he was keenly attuned to the changes that were happening as a result of the Enlightenment and the ongoing Napoleonic Wars. Between the three rabbis, and with the support of the lay leadership of the Consistoire, they issued a very bold and controversial ruling. They permitted the consumption of kitnius, legumes, such as rice, beans and lentils, on Pesach, so that the soldiers in Napoleon's Grand Armée could be fed over the festival and wouldn't go hungry. Let me just take a moment to explain what kitnius are and why Ashkenazi Jews don't eat them on Pesach. Kitnius refers to legumes like rice, beans, lentils, peas, corn, and even mustard seeds. These foods are not chometz. They don't ferment into leaven, so technically they should be permitted. But starting in medieval Ashkenaz, the rabbis saw that kitnius were often processed or stored alongside grains like wheat and barley, or ground into flour that looked a lot like chometz. People could easily get confused, either by mistaking rice flour for wheat flour or by failing to properly clean out chometz traces that were mixed into sacks of beans. To avoid accidents, a communal minhag developed to stay away from these foods entirely. Over time, it became a deeply rooted Ashkenazi tradition, with authorities like the Ramah codifying the custom into the Shulchan Aruch, into Halacha. Sfaradim, who didn't share the same concerns, never adopted the ban. That's why on Pesach you'll find Ashkenazim avoiding hummus and rice, while their Sephardi friends enjoy them guilt-free. It's not a Torah law, but it's a serious and widely respected minhag. Anyway, back to Westphalia in 1810. The rabbis ruled leniently. The soldiers had asked, "Can we eat kitnius?" And the rabbi said, yes. The Pesach was published as a formal proclamation on a poster in German that was printed with Hebrew letters. And the poster explained why kitnius was permitted, why they were permitting it. The Pesach was clear that the leniency only applied if the people who needed it checked the legumes carefully to remove any possible trace of chometz. And the three rabbis backed up the Pesach with classic sources. They quoted various Rishonim, including Rabbeinu Yerucham, who famously referred to the ban on kitnius as a minhag shtus, a foolish custom. Rabbeinu Yerucham was a minority voice against the kitnius prohibition in Ashkenazi tradition, but in this time of great need, the Westphalia rabbis and the community leaders felt they had his shoulders to lean on. This is what Rabbeinu Yerucham says about the kitnius prohibition. Uminhag zeh einoi elo minhag shtus. This custom is nothing but a foolish custom. A bold and unvarnished statement from a respected Rishon. And it gave the Westphalia rabbis confidence to be makil in a time of great need. The Westphalia rabbis also cited the Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi and his son Rav Yaakov Emden, both of whom had argued for leniency in the kitnius prohibition. Chacham Tzvi questioned the prohibition against kitnius, suggesting that it lacked a strong halachic foundation, adding that the chumrah led to unnecessary hardship, particularly for the poor. In his tshuva on the subject, he openly said that if he had the authority, he would abolish this custom due to its baselessness and the difficulties it imposed. And his concerns were rooted in the idea that the prohibition detracted from the joy of the holiday by limiting the number of permitted foods and causing financial strain. Rav Yaakov Emden, his son, in his work Morek Tzion Orach Chaim, echoed his father's sentiments. He lamented the continuation of the kitnius prohibition and expressed a desire for its abolition. Rav Emden, Rav Yaakov, emphasized that the custom was based on a mistake and caused unnecessary and widespread hardship. He expressed hope that leading halachic authorities would join him in annulling this practice entirely. Chacham Tzvi and Rav Yaakov Emden were two heavyweights, even if their opinion on kitnius was not adopted by the majority, and therefore remained theoretical, although they were still powerful enough to be used in this extreme situation as support to allow the Napoleonic soldiers to eat kitnius. In their proclamation, the rabbis of Westphalia told other rabbis not to shame those who followed their ruling. They said, "Let the rabbis not rebuke those who rely on the leniency, for great authorities have already ruled permissively, and the current circumstances warrant it." This ruling wasn't only about halacha, it was also about leadership, and it was about compassion. It was about understanding what people, and particularly the soldiers in Napoleon's army, were going through. In particular, it was about not using chumrus as a weapon, not just when it came to soldiers, not only in Westphalia, but in general. But here's the key part. Rather than issue a narrow wartime heter, something like, under these circumstances, under these emergency conditions, kitnius may be eaten this year, the three rabbis published a broad general kol koreh stating that kitnius should be permitted on Pesach, period. And, as you can imagine, not everyone was convinced. In fact, other rabbinic authorities, especially in Fürth, Bavaria, were incensed by what the Westphalia rabbis had said in their Pesach. They wrote scathing rebuttals, accusing the Westphalian rabbis of breaking centuries of halachic precedent. One rabbi wrote that they had no leg to stand on, and even if their intentions were noble, in other words, they had done it to ensure that the soldiers didn't go hungry, their ruling had set a dangerous precedent. The most prominent voice against the heter, against the ruling, was the Chassam Sofer of Moshe Sofer of Pressburg, Bratislava, who was originally German from Frankfurt. He wrote a tshuva in his book of Responsa, in his Shailas Tshuvas, Chelek Orach Chaim Siman Kuf Chof Beis, in which he rejected the ruling out of hand. "In my humble opinion," he wrote, "their arguments have not been clarified, and never will be clarified, which means that those leaders of the Westphalian community who permitted the eating of kidneys during Pesach have no halachic basis whatsoever, even if their intentions were good, and even if they had the best of motives. It still does not justify learning from them or adopting their ruling elsewhere. And he continued, God willing, I intend to deliver a public drasha on this exact topic to make clear that one cannot learn from their precedent. They did it for their own convenience, and their actions are not relevant for our communities. The Chasam Sofer does conclude quite humbly, offering a chink of light to the rabbis who had ruled leniently. If another great Torah scholar, he says, chooses to rule differently in his own region, that's his responsibility. But as for me, I will not touch the matter. I won't intervene with those in Westphalia, since it does not pertain to our people here. That's how he left it. But although he signed off with warmth and respect, he left no doubt in anyone's mind that he firmly opposed the leniency and refused to allow it to serve as precedent for his community or for other communities. As far as the Chasam Sofer was concerned, even during Napoleon's wars, even when Jewish soldiers were desperate for food, he would not accept the leniency of allowing kitnius for Pesach. And as he was the greatest rabbi of his day, the Pesach of the Westphalia rabbis remained a fringe, time-bound leniency. You know, all of this raises a really important halachic question, one that's not just theoretical, but very practical for anyone in a war zone or under duress. What happens to halacha in a battlefield? What happens when the strict application of halacha isn't possible? Do the rules bend or do they break? The Torah, and later the rabbis, didn't leave us guessing. The Gemara in Chulin, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, tells us that during the conquest of the land of Israel under Yehoshua, the Jewish people were allowed to eat non-kosher food. Specifically, the verse says, Ubatim meleim kol tuv. They entered houses filled with all kinds of good things. And Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, in the name of Rav, explained that this even included pork, katle de chazire. The Rambam codified this halacha in Hilchos Melochim. He says, Mutar lahem le'echol nevelos utrefos uvasa chazir imro'ev. In other words, and the Rambam is totally clear and blunt, soldiers are allowed to eat non-kosher food, even pork, if they are hungry and have no other food to eat. But here's the nuance. The Rambam's understanding, especially as explained by the Radvaz, is that this isn't straightforward pikuach nefesh, where of course anything is allowed. It's not that the soldiers are about to die of hunger. It's something more subtle. What we might call today pikuach nefesh tziburi, public danger, or more precisely, a potential for grave danger to the wider public if the rules are adhered to. The moment soldiers would start worrying about where they'll find kosher food, they would stop being focused on survival, on their job. They would stop being concerned about winning. They would stop being vigilant in their military duties, and that puts us all in danger. The Radvaz says it like this: Einom tzrichim litrach levakesh machal heter, ki im yelchu levakesh machal. The soldiers don't need to go looking for kosher food, because that search itself puts them and us in danger. The Netziv of Volozhin echoes this idea in his Perush on Dvarim Perik Vav Pasuk Yud. Kol hakpoda b'macholim b'shas milchama maybe l'sakonas nefoshes. Any strictness about food during war creates a danger to life. In other words, war creates its own halachic ecosystem. It's not only about personal survival for the soldiers. They need to be at the top of their game so that they can defend us against enemies that want to kill us. Halacha recognizes that. Sometimes you need to eat just to stay focused, just to function. And that is also considered a kind of pikuach nefesh. Not everyone agrees with the Rambam's view that this is about pikuach nefesh tziburi. The Ramban, in his commentary on the Torah, also on Dvarim Perik Vav Pasuk Yud, takes a very different tack, a very different approach. Ramban says that when the Torah describes the Israelites entering the land and finding houses full of all good things, the good things that they discuss, that is mentioned, isn't just permitted food. It could be anything, even things that would be normally forbidden, like pork, arla, or wine used for idolatry. But the Ramban says it was all permitted. So far he's just like the Rambam and Radvaz, but then he diverges completely. The treif food, he says, wasn't allowed because they were starving or because there was a pressing danger. Instead, this is what the Ramban says, V'hishlit oisam b'chol hanimtza ba'oretz b'mutar v'asur. God gave them dominion over everything in the land during the war, both things which are permitted and things which are forbidden. It was a rule that applied for the war. In other words, this was a special wartime heter, not based on pikuach nefesh, but rooted in the concept of milchemes mitzvah, and specifically the conquest of Eretz Canaan in the time of Yehoshua. When you're conquering the land, says Ramban, the rules shift, the framework changes. Halachas which bind us in ordinary Jewish life are set aside. But, as I mentioned this already, according to Ramban, this heter was limited. It only applied during the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, and only for that generation. It was a one-time hoira'as shah, an exceptional wartime allowance granted during Yehoshua's campaign, which was 14 years. It didn't extend to later wars, and certainly not to Jewish soldiers fighting under non-Jewish armies in exile. So, Ramban would not have supported the heter of the rabbis in Westphalia. That's the contrast. The Rambam sees the heter as rooted in practical military needs, a kind of logic that might still apply today. The Ramban sees it as a historical anomaly, tied to a unique divine promise, and not a general license. The difference between them is huge. It couldn't be bigger. According to the Rambam, you could argue for leniencies in any war, even today, based on pikuach nefesh tziburi and the psychological toll of hunger or distraction. But Ramban wouldn't go there. Unless you are in the middle of a milchemes mitzvah to conquer the land of Israel, and God has promised you total victory, you'd better stick to kosher. That's what the Ramban says. Which brings me to one of the most fascinating examples of this tension in more recent times. Halachic decisions made during World War I, because here, too, we see the age-old tug-of-war between fidelity to halacha and the human need for flexibility under extreme conditions. The name that comes up again and again is Rav Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. Rav Kook was one of the most luminous halachic and spiritual minds of the 20th century, a man who balanced unshakable attachment to tradition with profound sensitivity to the human conditions and to the modern era. Earlier, we saw how in 1810 the rabbis of Westphalia permitted kitnius on Pesach due to the food shortage caused by Napoleon's wars. Their ruling was broad, sweeping and controversial, and it caused enormous pushback. But fast forward a century and you'll find Rav Kook facing a similar kind of crisis and handling it with a halachic temperament that made him stand apart from many of his contemporaries. It was 1909 in Jaffa. Rav Kook was the chief rabbi of the growing Jewish community in this ancient port city, when he was approached by a man whose name was Ben Zion Breslov. Breslov had just opened a sesame oil factory, and he came to Rav Kook with a question. Can you give me a hechsher for this sesame oil that I produce on Pesach? Now sesame, like other kitnius, is off limits to Ashkenazim on Pesach, and sesame oil is even worse. Some poskim held that oils made from kitnius are more prohibited than the legumes themselves, since extracting the oil usually requires soaking them in water, which raises the risk of chometz. But Breslov's factory was different. His oil was extracted from dry sesame seeds, processed without any water at all. There was no real chometz concern, and more than that, this was a locally produced Jewish-made product in Eretz Yisrael at a time when imported kosher food was unreliable, expensive, and often unavailable. Rav Kook didn't give a quick yes or no. He personally visited the factory. He watched the machinery. He studied the process, and he gave the hechsher. He ruled that the sesame oil was permitted for Pesach use. Not just permitted, he encouraged people to support local Jewish production and benefit from the land's own bounty, Eretz Yisrael, as long as it could be done within halachic boundaries. Not everyone was thrilled. The old Yishuv Rabbonim in Jerusalem erupted in protest. They published posters condemning the decision. "This is a dangerous breach of tradition," they said. But Rav Kook didn't back down. He published a public kuntras, a halachic pamphlet titled Kuntras al Dvar Hashemen, a pamphlet concerning the sesame oil produced from dry seeds not soaked in water and suitable for Pesach use. In the pamphlet, he explained the full halachic background, the economic context, and his reasoning. This was not a sweeping break from Ashkenazi custom. It was a case-specific ruling based on the facts, the needs of the moment, and a desire to uphold halacha while also keeping Jews from going hungry. And behind it all, there was something else. Rav Kook believed, the very core of his being, that in the early years of the return to Eretz Yisrael, halacha needed to be applied with heart, with an eye toward bringing people in rather than pushing them away. He understood that chumras have a place, but so does compassion. If halacha could be observed without turning people off or turning them out, that was the path he wanted to walk. It was the same approach that guided him in supporting the heter mechira during Shemitah. Rav Kook wanted farmers in the land of Israel to be able to remain solvent, feed their families and stay on the land, Eretz Yisrael, while still keeping halacha, even if it wasn't gold standard. So he permitted a legal mechanism that allowed the land to be sold temporarily to non-Jews, allowing work to continue. Rav Kook didn't force anyone to rely on the heter mechira. On the contrary, he respected those who wanted to be stringent, but he believed that halacha could offer a way forward and not be a wall, a prevention. A few years later, in 1917, Rav Kook found himself in London, stranded there by the First World War. He had been appointed rabbi of Machzik Hadas, the leading synagogue of the Eastern European, strictly Orthodox Haredi community. At that time, food shortages were severe. Rice, however, was available. Matzah and kosher for Pesach staples were not. Thousands of Jewish soldiers on the front lines in the trenches of Europe faced the possibility of going hungry. Even London's Jews faced this same predicament. The chief rabbi of Great Britain, Rabbi Dr. Joseph Hertz, who was far from being a halachic authority, approached Rav Kook. "What do we do?" he asked him. "Can we permit rice this year, given the situation?" Now, based on Rav Kook's 1909 sesame oil ruling, you might expect him to have said, yes, straight out. "It's not chometz, it's a minhag, it's war, permit it." But that's not what he did. Rav Kook, with characteristic humility and not a small amount of political acumen, said to Rav Hertz, "Who am I that you should ask me to advise? You have so many learned rabbonim here in England, in London and in the provinces. Why not ask them?" Instead of ruling alone, he encouraged Rabbi Dr. Hertz to convene a conference of rabbonim, of rabbis, something that had never happened in British Jewish history. Until then, the Eastern European foreign rabbis had been seen as second class. Now they were all brought to the table. The result was that the rabbis voted not to permit rice. But something much deeper had happened. Rav Kook had set a precedent for collaborative rabbinic leadership, and he'd elevated the stature of the Haredi rabbis in England, which actually changed the face of Anglo Jewry forever. But that's another story for another time. So, what do we think? Would Rav Kook have ruled leniently had he issued a Pesach? Most likely yes. But he didn't. For whatever reason, Rav Kook chose to defer to others, and they were not as bold as him. Now, let me take you to Moscow. In 1992, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. I was serving as the assistant rabbi at the Moscow Choral Synagogue, and in the days leading up to Pesach, I witnessed something I will never forget. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, stood in the freezing cold, queued up patiently, waiting for a single thing: matzah. Old babushkas in scarves, men in threadbare coats, children clinging to plastic bags, all hoping to get even a box or two of matzah for Pesach. Most of them couldn't read Hebrew. They had no idea what the Haggadah said. If they held a Seder, it was bare bones at best. They knew Tolstoy better than they knew Hilchos Pesach. And they certainly didn't know whether the matzah they had received was shmura or machine-made, whether it had been baked within 18 minutes, or if it was even truly kosher for Pesach. I asked Rabbi Pinchas Goldschmidt, the chief rabbi of Moscow, and he was my boss, if the matzahs were halachically acceptable. He shrugged, and he said, probably not, at least not to the standards you and I would eat. So why were we handing them out? Because for these Jews who had survived Stalin, the KGB, underground brisses and secret seders, this matzah was everything. It was their link to their ancestors, their connection to a rich heritage, their Jewishness. It wasn't just the bread of affliction. It was the bread of identity, of Jewish identity, the bread of connection, the bread of hope. And Halacha has room for that. Rav Moshe Feinstein, in a tshuva addressing whether non-observant Jews can be counted for religious matters, famously argued that we must treat Jews who are far from Torah observance with compassion and inclusion, especially when they maintain any attachment, however minimal, to tradition. That attachment, he said, must be honored. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was even more direct. When asked whether matzah baked under duress in Soviet Russia, without proper supervision, and possibly not even technically kosher, could still be used at the Seder, he responded, if they risked their lives to bake matzah, then yes, that matzah is holy. Was it kosher in the strict halachic sense? Maybe not. But in the redemptive spiritual sense, it was more than kosher. It was sacred. During the 1950s and 60s, under Khrushchev's religious clampdown, matzah became far more than a food item. It became a badge of courage, a quiet, determined protest against the attempt to erase Jewish identity. One example stands out. A Lubavitcher Chassid named Aaron Chazan, who lived in Bolshevo near Moscow. Aaron transformed his home into a secret matzah bakery in the weeks before Pesach. With his children, he baked round shmura matzah for the Hasidic families and a very basic square machine-cut matzah for the broader Jewish public, often delivering the matzah by hand to the elderly and to the sick. His daughter, Devorah Greenberg, later recalled, they weren't only religious Jews who came to our house to buy matzah. Everybody looked for it. They'd ask each other, do you know where I can find some matzah? I want to buy some matzah. This wasn't an isolated phenomenon. In 1958 alone, more than 650,000 pounds of matzah were baked in just 4 cities, Moscow, Kiev, Vinnytsia and Zhemerinka. According to a Soviet government report, later declassified, most of the Jewish population consumes matzah, even the non-religious ones. And in some cases, this is what the report says, even communists. One particularly heartbreaking case was that of Velvel Bogomolny, a shoichet who worked for the Moscow Choral Synagogue. In 1963, he was arrested by the KGB while delivering matzah and sentenced to a year in a labor camp for profiteering that Pesach his family sent him a care package. But the prison guards removed the matzah. He survived the 8 days on sugar cubes alone. He didn't cut any corners for himself. And he never stopped believing it was worth it, because for him and for so many others, the act of baking, eating and delivering matzah was an act of spiritual defiance, a refusal to let go of who they were. Matzah was the essence of their Jewish identity. So was the matzah in the Soviet Union for Passover. I don't know if it was kosher for Passover, not by the standards of the Shulchan Aruch, but it was kosher in the eyes of heaven. And for those Jews and for all of us, that's what truly matters. No rabbi in his right mind would have told them not to eat it. Not then, not ever. And that brings us to the present. We are not in the trenches of Napoleon's Europe. We are not huddled in Moscow in a cellar by candlelight baking matzah. We're not scouring the bombed out fields of World War I looking for a crust of kosher food. Baruch Hashem, we're not living under Stalin or Khrushchev. We live in Beverly Hills or in New York or Lakewood or London or in Eretz Yisrael, which Baruch Hashem has everything any Jew could ever dream of needing or wanting, for Pesach and for any time. But we are still surrounded by challenges. Some are spiritual. How do we pass on tradition in an open secular world? How do we explain to our children why we don't eat rice on Pesach when their Sephardi friends do and it's not even chometz? How do we explain why chumras are important but not absolute? How do we explain why minhagim matter but shouldn't override compassion or common sense? Some challenges are physical, like the soldiers of the IDF today. There are soldiers right now stationed in Gaza or on the northern front or deep in hostile territory in Syria and Lebanon. And this Pesach, just like in 1810 or 1917, they will be asking, what can I eat? What must I avoid? What does Halacha demand of me? And what does it allow? We need to be ready with answers, sensitive answers, courageous answers, halachically grounded answers. Because the Jewish people don't survive through chumras alone. We survive through Torah, through wisdom and through love. Rav Kook understood this. So did the Westphalia rabbis and Rav Moshe Feinstein and Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And so did every Jewish Russian who baked matzah under Soviet tyranny, just so that their children would know what it means to be a Jew. Pesach is not just about what we eat, it's about who we are. It's about our memory and our faith and our future. It's about staying connected even when the flour is scarce, the oven is hidden, and the halachic ideal isn't fully possible. There's a time for chumrah and there's a time for leniency, but there is never a time to abandon a fellow Jew who is trying to hold on. This Pesach, as we, all of us, sit down to our beautifully set Seder tables with shmura matzah and the finest wine and carefully checked lettuce, let's take a moment to think about the people who had none of that, but held on to everything that matters. And then let's ask ourselves, what are we doing to ensure the next generation gets the same gift? Because that's what real halachic leadership is about. And that's what real freedom is about too. Thank you.